Hello again. Welcome to Chapter 4. This chapter is called Andeg. Take a look at the picture there. I wonder who Andeg is. Take a guess. So the world changed when Father was home. Remember Omakai's day, or dad, was a voyageur, and he came home. Everyone had to be more careful and orderly. When Mama and Grandma were in charge, there was a way to do things, of course, and yet there was room to make mistakes. Mistakes were funny and could be fixed. With Omakai's father, Mikwam, or Ice, everything had to be done exactly right. He was a commanding person, over 6 feet tall, and with a shrewdness in his expression that impressed other men. Often he dressed himself quite handsomely. Full turban, beaded velvet vest, calico shirt of fine red cloth, a bandolier bag, earrings. He always wore at least one fancy earring. It glittered and spun at his jaw when he abruptly halted or changed direction in his walking. Mikwam was very funny, and the camp was always full of laughter. But it was an uneasy laughter, and any moment Dede's mood could change to barbed annoyance. Much of the laughter had to do with her father's sly wit and sharp tongue. There was no one who could not imitate. There was no one he could not imitate. No one who escaped the sharp humor of his gaze. No one about whom he could not make a joke. He even teased old Tallow. But he loved giving her little gifts too, and in the evenings he told stories until way after the owls began to call. With Dede home, things were more exciting, things were more difficult, things were less predictable, but somehow more secure. First thing Dede noticed was the corn, how tall it had grown, how the rain had plumped up the ears. What a good crop they had this year. Mama and Grandma were pleased and contented with the crop, but Dede was jealous of the amount of new corn he saw the crows devouring. Early in the morning of the second day, he was home. He cut poles and used basswood twine to rope together 2 platforms, one on either side of the cornfield. When he had tied the legs securely, and when he had positioned them just so, he called Angeline and Omakai's. So here's a picture of Omakai's Dede. And he's dressed up in some colorful clothes. I mean, it's a black and white drawing, I give you that, but you got to understand something. These clothes seem maybe a little outrageous, maybe to you and I, but this is a different culture, a different time. And these clothes go to symbolize how important a person this Dede is. I mean, he sounds like a guy that nobody wants to mess with. Right? Right. Okay. Let's see what's happening. Let's get this crazy thing out of the way. I want you to climb up and stay here and drive away the birds. He gave Omakai's 2 small sticks to clack together to frighten the flocks, and Angeline his tattered old shirt to flap in the air. He didn't need it anymore, for Mama had made him a new suit of clothes. A calico shirt, skin leggings, a set of blue broadcloth breeches, trimmed with red wool. Onto the shirt she had sewn 4 carefully hoarded brass buttons, gleaming, each marked with the French flower that the voyageurs called fleur de lis. Now on a sunny day, with a sweet haze in the air and the promise of rain low and far at the edge of the horizon, Omachias and Angeline started for the cornfield. They argued back and forth about everything and nothing. Stubborn and bored with each other, they fell silent. The garden place lay at the end of a short path through the woods. And on the way they walked without a sound, each lost in her thoughts, perhaps because they had fallen into that angry silence. And they walked quietly enough to come upon One Horn, the magnificent buck deer who had lost half of his antler rack defending his island territory. He seemed to have damaged his head in some way so that only one of his antlers grew back properly. It was a beautiful antler, proud and pointed, but the other one was only a stump. Unafraid of the girls, One Horn stepped out into the path and stood alert early in the early light, basking a little, warming his coat. Omachias and Angeline stood still, held by his beauty and the strength of his gaze. His graceful, leaf-shaped ears tilted forward as though he could hear their hearts beating. His brown eyes were commanding and kind. He took a step toward them and stopped. Another step. Stopped. And then suddenly, as though yanked into the air by a giant invisible rope, he leaped. He disappeared. He must have heard something we didn't, Angeline said. And sure enough, Day was behind them. Right behind them with no warning. "What's wrong with you girls?" he said, his voice sharp. "The crows are feasting while you stand here and jabber. He walked past him, his stride long. They hurried to the field, climbed onto their platforms, and shooed away what few birds had settled in the corn. At first it was fun to wave and shout across the field from their perches. "Booz-hoo!" called Omachias. "Booz-hoo!" called Angeline. "Nanoond, wessin!" Omachias yelled. "I'm hungry too," was the answer. "What did you bring to eat?" Angeline had brought nothing. "We could roast some corn," suggested Omachias from across the field. "We could roast some crows," cried Angeline. "Well, how will we catch them?" shouted Omachias. "Well, I'll get Nokomis's fishing net," Angeline answered, "and we'll throw it over them when they land." So far, not a single bird had eaten so much as a kernel of corn because the two girls were making so much noise. But as soon as Angeline left her stand to fetch the net from Grandma, a whirling cloud descended. The smart crows and red-winged blackbirds knew when their chances of getting a bite of corn had improved. The crows spread over the corn with cries of greed. Ravens, bigger and smarter, waited on the outskirts of the field to see whether it was safe to join the feast. Determined, Omachias yelled louder and clacked her sticks. She had helped harvest each seed saved in Mama's seed bag. She had watered those seeds with water hauled from the lake. Maycuck after maycuck of water until they sprouted and grew. Then she had loosened the earth and weeded with Mama's big moose antler hoe and her own smaller hoe carved from a crooked tree branch. She had guided those corn plants and worked hard, and she was not now going to give up the winter's dried corn soup to a flock of birds, no matter how hungry they were. Again, the birds fell in the corn with starving cries. Again, Omachias ran down screaming to drive them off. Day was right. The birds' eyes glittered greedily as they tore into each plump ear of corn and pecked at the juicy young kernels. Their cries were ferocious until her sister returned. Their cries were ferocious. Until her sister returned, Omachias ran from the end of the field to the other, shouting, flapping her dad's old shirt, or clacking the sticks. After a time, she was too tired to run fast, and her shout came out a croak as hoarse as the crows. Angeline returned with the net finally, and they tried to cast it over the birds. The net worked much better at catching fish. However, wide and gracefully they tried to toss it, the net always flew clumsily. The birds saw it coming, darted off, and even seemed to laugh with taunting cries as they landed, eating noisily in another part of the field. "We got to trick them," Angeline said. "Trick them? How?" Omachias panted. "Well, I've got an idea," said Angeline. They draped one of Grandma's nets carefully over the corn stalks to make a ceiling. Angeline stood behind. She stood behind the cornstalk room with the other net held wide, and Omachias ran to the other side of the field. When the birds landed before her, she slowly, unhurriedly, with no shouting and no sudden movements, walked toward her sister. The birds hopped before her or flew a short distance. They were not frightened enough to wheel high in the air. They continued toward the net and then slipped under the nets to forage. Hopped further beneath towards Angeline until they finally ran into the wall of twines and flapped high into the ceiling of the net. In alarm, they panicked, tried to fly through the links Nokomis had woven, and caught a foot, a wing, or a tiny head. Even though she had hated them just an hour before, Omachias now felt badly about betraying them. And as she drove the birds into the net, she begged them to forgive her, saying the words she had heard her grandmother use. "Forgive us. Forgive us. We have need. We have need." She turned away as Angeline caught each struggling, flapping bird and broke its neck with one quick, strong twist. They harvested the birds for the next hour, and they harvested the birds for the next hour and the next hour, until the sun sank low and the remaining birds withdrew to their perches for the night. Then, as Omachias was gathering in and folding Nokomis' net, she noticed one bird was left, struggling hard to free itself. It was a young crow from a late nest. Though it hopped up and down with great energy, it couldn't quite fly. They already had a pile of birds large enough to fill the biggest parching tray, which Angeline had fetched from the camp. Omachias decided to set this last bird free, and she gently undid the basswood fiber twine from the sharp, black clawed foot, its neck a ragged, baby feathered wing. Holding the bird in her hand, she set it on the ground and waited for it to fly off. It stood still. When she tried to shoo it into the air, it only hopped a few steps. Dragged a hurt wing. Omachias looked around for a heavy stick to club it, to put it out of its pain. And then something stopped her. She looked down at the bird. It gazed up at her with such a calm, trusting curiosity that it almost seemed to speak aloud. Its round eyes were a deep milky blue, and it cocked its head sideways, back and forth, to get a good look at Omachias. She looked around to see if Angeline was watching. She wasn't. So with a swift movement, Omachias reached down and scooped the bird into the small carrying sack at her waist. It nestled in so silently that she soon forgot all about it. Omachias and Angeline spent what seemed like an endless time plucking the birds, cleaning them.